Most people are familiar with the London Underground, or the Tube, the network of rapid transit lines that serves London and its suburbs with iconic red, white, and blue trains. But London actually has another railway that is branded as the complete opposite of the Underground, and that would be the Overground. And in today's video, I'm going to tell you all about it. Hi there, my name's Reece and I run a channel called RMTransit about turning transit lines into transit networks. As I said in the intro, the London Underground is definitely something you're going to want to be familiar with when watching this video. So if you're not already, I recommend you go and check out this video first and then come back. In short, the Overground is a series of urban rail lines that forms a coherent network much like the Underground. This network actually skirts central London for the most part and operates above ground. Surprise, surprise. It's also worth pointing out that the majority of the Underground network is above ground, but we still call it the Underground. The services on the Overground are really quite good and generally operate every 15 minutes or even more frequently. So with Overground services, you can generally show up without referring to a schedule. And while the routes don't have a ton of value for getting around central areas of London, they have value for getting around the rest of the city, and even being used as last mile connections from other more urban rail services, or even for just connecting from one rail line to another. The Overground was created in the late 2000s by Transport for London, and now has over 100 stations across the city. But the vast majority of the system is not newly built lines. Instead, it's a rebranding of lines which already had semi-acceptable service. This way, the lines could be operated under the TfL banner, albeit with orange, white, and blue instead of red, white, and blue trains. That meant cleaning up stations, buying new trains, improving accessibility, upgrading technology, installing new signage, and in a few select cases, rebuilding old stations or even building brand new ones while extending lines. Despite frequent calls all over the world for a London Overground style system, often on corridors where there isn't currently passenger service and might not even be the track infrastructure for it, as I said before, the London Overground wasn't really a new build rail network. Instead, it was an upgrading, amalgamation, and rebranding of a bunch of existing rail services. To be clear, the fact that the Overground wasn't really a new network isn't a bad thing. It just means that a lot of discussion around it often misses the point that the Overground makes, which is that the branding and integration of a transit service is incredibly important, not just having it exist in the first place. It's also worth knowing because it's not necessarily so easy to just bring a rail network into being out of nothing. Currently, the Overground consists of 6 corridors or lines which are electrified with either 750 volt DC third rail or 25 kilovolt AC overhead wires. Now, the routes can broadly be divided into 2 categories: orbital routes, which encircle the city, and radial routes, which head in and out of it. The first orbital route is the Gospel Oak to Barking line, which is often shortened to the Goblin. This line orbits London in the northeast and until 5 years ago was a diesel line. It's only recently been electrified with 25 kilovolt AC overhead wires. Next up is the East London line, which is electrified with 750 volt DC third rail and was actually at one point part of the Tube network. However, with the opening of the network, the East London line was extended both north and south, creating a new broad eastern and southern orbital route with branches to Croydon and New Cross. The shortest line on the Overground is the Romford to Upminster shuttle train, which has 3 stops, including one in the middle at Emerson Park, which connects between Greater Anglia and Crossrail and the District Line and C2C services. The shuttle is electrified with AC overhead lines. The final orbital route on the London Overground is the North London line. Creative line names, I know. This line runs to the west and north of the city and, in combination with the East London line, forms a full loop around London, with the eastern portion of the loop being closer to the city centre than the western portion, and connection points at Clapham Junction, Highbury and Islington, and Canonbury. There's also a connection at Gospel Oak to the Goblin. In addition, the North London line actually extends beyond Canonbury to the rail mega hub of Stratford, where you can connect to the DLR, multiple different tube lines, the Elizabeth line, as well as other services. And the North London line actually has a mix of 750 volt DC third rail and 25 kilovolt AC overhead lines. Now, as it turns out, the Overground actually does also have some radial services which connect between central terminals and the suburbs. The first of these is the Watford DC line, which is electrified, unsurprisingly, using 750 volt DC third rail, and runs from Watford to the northwest of London through to Euston Station, with a connection to the North London line at Willesden Junction. The other radial corridor is a bit more of a set of lines known as the Lee Valley lines, which travel north out of Liverpool Street Station and further north along the River Lee, with connections to the North London line in Hackney, before splitting into branches. One goes to Chingford, which has a connection to the Goblin in Walthamstow, as well as a branch to Enfield Town and Cheshunt, which has a connection to the Goblin at South Tottenham. All of these lines are electrified at 25 kV AC. Actual service frequencies on the various overground lines vary a fair amount, although basically every service has a minimum service frequency cutoff of every 15 minutes. And in areas where multiple services overlap, which actually exist in a few places on the network, services are more frequent. And the trains which actually provide that service are fantastic. The original new trains used on the Overground, the Capital Star sets, are wonderful. And they remind me a lot of the S-Stock trains on the Underground, albeit with fewer doors. That being said, they are fully walk-through and also have entirely longitudinal seating, which feels a lot like the Underground, making them really quite nice for suburban trains. These older Capital Star sets have actually been augmented by the new Class 710 trains, which are Bombardier Aventras, the same sort of trains that you see on the Elizabeth line. These trains add to the older ones Wi-Fi, USB charging, really nice digital wayfinding, and just a generally cool look. And while I don't disagree that Wi-Fi is a frill that you don't need on public transport, as someone who doesn't have a local cell carrier in the UK, when I was visiting, it was really quite useful. And I can imagine a lot of times it might be useful for locals as well. It's worth noting that the new trains were a big part of the transformation in the visible quality of service that happened when the Overground network was started. And they honestly feel in line with any nice modern metro or suburban train. Funnily enough, portions of the Overground network are still shared with portions of the Underground network, including on the District line headed into Richmond. And yes, at Whitechapel the Overground goes under the Underground. Try saying that 5 times fast. Looking back, what's really made the Overground so special is that it took the best practices that TfL had developed running the Underground and its other rail services and applied it to a bunch of underutilized rail services. It was new rapid transit, with some new stations and all of the amenities you'd expect, but these lines were not perfect. For example, many of the connections between the Overground and other networks and services require walking some distance on the street, albeit sometimes it's as simple as literally just walking across the street. However, part of the innovation of a network like TfL is the smart wayfinding that acknowledges these connections, which can be practically made, and the fare zone system with Oyster that makes them, from a route planning perspective, really no different than an in-station interchange. Ultimately, I see the Overground as being able to show us what really matters in an urban rail network. Clarity and convenience are probably underrated, and direct connectivity is probably overrated to an extent. There are still some gaps. For example, despite having over 100 stations, the branding of the Overground is still uniform with its orange lines, including on maps, which can be quite confusing. Fortunately, it sounds like an initiative from the Mayor of London is going to come around to start actually giving names to the lines, which is valuable in elevating them to something beyond just being part of the Overground into being lines of significant value by themselves. Perhaps the greatest value of the Overground is just starting to be realized though. One of the most confusing elements of using public transport in and around London is that while you do have TfL services, you have a bajillion other services that exist under other operators, like Southeastern, C2C, Greater Anglia, GTR, Thameslink. There's a ton of different operators, and it can be kind of confusing moving between their different services, even if they're all part of the national rail network. One of the biggest benefits of the Overground, in my personal opinion, is the sort of rationalization and backdoor de-balkanization of some of these services, so that they're all brought under a single, easy-to-understand umbrella. You can actually see that process happening in real time. The Lee Valley lines are a relatively new addition to the Overground, for example. They were taken over from Greater Anglia, and there's constantly talk of taking over more services. And to be clear, that's not necessarily super complex. The train operating companies can continue to operate the trains. It's simply the branding that would change, so that a train that's currently, say, C2C becomes a London Overground train. And that opens up a lot of exciting opportunities, like for example the idea of Thameslink just properly becoming part of the TfL network and getting branding similar to the Elizabeth line, which it plays a similar role to. There is also the greater question of how the Elizabeth line, the Overground, and the various other mainline railways in London are meant to be interrelated and co-branded in the long term, but that's a question for a different video. So the Overground is an urban train network, and a great one at that. But it's also something bigger. It's an idea and a conversation starter at the center of an integrated mobility network. And that's really exciting. Thanks for watching.